So we are now being recorded. And that wasn't a huge virtual jump that I thought it was going to be. I thought we'd go into cyberspace and come back again, but here we are. So, but we now do have participants, I think. Yes, we have attendees with us, so, okay. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, depending on where you are dialing in from today. And welcome to the first mini symposium of the Global Social Medicine Network. My name is Michelle Pentecost. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London. I'm also an honorary researcher in the School of Medicine at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And it is my privilege today to chair the first of two conversations on social medicine from the South on behalf of the Global Social Medicine Network, which is a Wellcome-funded network that aims to bring together scholars from all regions who are committed to a vision of social medicine as a vital intersection of social sciences, medical practice, and policy. So I'd like to welcome our network, our panelists and colleagues from all over the world who are joining us today. We have 150 registrants for this conference. Many of these colleagues are linked to our network and also to sister networks such as the Social Medicine Consortium and the Medical Health Humanities Africa Network, among others. I'd also like to thank the steering committee of the network who have worked to put this event together, including Professors Vincent Adams, Carlo Kaduf, Jeremy Green, Helena Hansen, David Jones, Junko Kitanaka, Francisco Ortega, and Nicholas Rose. I'd also like to thank our assistant, Alice Hilborn, for her work on putting this event together. So welcome all of you, and thank you very much for joining us today.
So thanks so much, Michelle. Should I speak?
Give me one moment, please,
Okay.
Jeremy. So today we are very fortunate to have the first of two conversations that center on social medicine as a truly global field. And we're using this provocation around the question of relations and relatedness between the contested categories of North and South to foreground the diversity of approaches to thinking and doing social medicine. So today we will be linking conversations between contexts, including Zimbabwe, the US, India, and Rio. But we're going to start with an introduction to the Global Social Medicine Network by my esteemed colleagues, Professors Jeremy Green and Helena Hansen. And then I'll introduce each of our panelists who will offer a 10-minute response. And then we will have ample time for discussion. So for the audience members, please do post questions in the chat and note them down as we go. And we will take questions both for individual panelists and for the collective at the end of the presentations. And we have quite a lot of time for discussion, so we're really hoping that that can be as robust as possible. In our pre-conference meeting, we were just discussing the difficulties of replicating a slightly more ordinary conference experience or symposium experience in these virtual spaces. So we encourage everyone to be as interactive as possible. Please feel free so we can try and have a nice conversation. The session will be recorded and uploaded on our website, so you will also be able to share it with your networks as well. Of course, there are also those who are in a time zone that might not be slightly amenable to a 1 p.m. Event, so we've recorded it for that purpose. So let me introduce Professors Green and Hansen, who will offer us an introduction to the Global Social Medicine Network. It's a privilege to learn from them both, and we're especially grateful to Prof. Hansen, for whom it is very early in the morning in Los Angeles. Professor Hansen is a psychiatrist and anthropologist and the professor and chair of the research theme in translational social science and health equity at UCLA's David Geffen School of Medicine. She's published widely in clinical and social science journals on faith healing of addiction in Puerto Rico, psychiatric disability under welfare reform, opioids and race, the ethnic marketing of pharmaceuticals, and structural competency. Her first book, Addicted to Christ, was published by University of California Press in 2018, and her second book, Structural Competency in Medicine and Mental Health, a case-based approach to treating the social determinants of health, co-edited with Jonathan Metzl, was published by Springer in 2019. Her third book, Whiteout: How Racial Capital Changed the Color of Heroin in America, is forthcoming from UC Press. We're really looking forward to that. Professor Jeremy Green is a physician and historian of medicine. He is the founding director of the Center for Medical Humanities and Social Medicine at Johns Hopkins University. He's also associate faculty in the Berman Institute of Bioethics and holds joint appointments in the Department of History of Science and Technology and the Department of Anthropology at the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. He is the author of two books, Prescribing by Numbers, Drugs and the Definition of Disease, and Generic, The Unbranding of Modern Medicine, both published by Johns Hopkins University Press. And his forthcoming book with the University of Chicago examines how changing expectations of instantaneous communication through electronic, and digital media is transforming the nature of medical practice and medical knowledge. And I'm sure that Professor Green is going to be writing a lot about the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on that, and we look forward to that publication as well. So thank you, Profs Green and Hansen, for your introduction to the Global Social Medicine Network, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. It's been such a pleasure working with you on this project and really with everyone in imagining the Global Social Medicine Network. I know that Helena Hansen is going to be joining. I think she's having a hard time with her.
I'm here.
There we go. And so really, I think our introduction is just intended to be just a brief welcome and maybe a bit of a description about what this phrase global social medicine means and what the Global Social Medicine Network hopes to do. As Michelle mentioned just earlier, there are a number of other exciting alignments in this space between the global social medicine consortium, other ways of bringing together this field of social medicine into prominence. And yet for many people, maybe even for some attending today, the term social medicine might still come across as a new term or a term that hasn't been one in daily use. And so it's a term with a plurality of histories. And I think oftentimes the history that is commonly told of social medicine is one that starts with figures like Rudolf Virchow in 19th century, Prussia, and it's a very much a European and then globalizing kind of history of social medicine. And yet social medicine means very different things and has very different kinds of roots in autochthonous traditions coming from sub-Saharan Africa, coming from Latin America, coming from Southeast Asia, coming from East Asia. And the real pleasure of pulling together some key scholars and practitioners in different centers that have been devoted to articulating the field of social medicine in different parts of the world has been trying to figure out, we'll map these commonalities. So what is it that social medicine has in common in all these places? What are the differences? What is being overemphasized or underemphasized? And especially in light of today's conference, how is it that we might better attend to what it means to think about social medicine from the South? I think that one basic set of rough agreements we've come to in our conversations is that, all of these approaches to social medicine are based on the fundamental observation that our understandings of health and disease can never be encompassed in biological terms alone, and that medical science and practice are inextricable from the social and cultural worlds in which diagnosis and therapeutics take place. And we would argue that this observation has a new kind of urgency in the 21st century as for a variety of reasons, both epidemiological, media-based, in terms of how news circulates and how information is processed. There's a new urgency to attention of social determinants of health and disease. And yet there's also still divergence between these different programs in different schools. So the Global Social Medicine Network was initially founded by a series of institutions, including many represented here, Jawaharlal Nehru University, University of California, San Francisco, King's College London, Johns Hopkins, University of California, Los Angeles, Keio University, Harvard University, Universidad del Estado de Rio de Janeiro, and the University of Minnesota, and University of Witwatersrand, University of Edinburgh, American University of Beirut, Institut Pasteur, and University of Lausanne. And the goal is not for this to be like, this is the sum total of what this network is, but to think in an expanding sense of, well, how can we actually bring meaningful exchanges between sites and scholars and practitioners and advocates that are dedicated to merging the study of the social world and its relationship to health with training, advocacy, and action of healthcare professionals and public health policies. And today's discussion promises to shed new light in those dimensions, and I really look forward to it. I'll turn it over to Dr. Hansen.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. You did a fantastic job framing this, and I just have a very brief comment before we get started. It's early on my end, very early on my end, so I'm so happy that you've done such a complete job. I just want to flag that one of our big projects, an ambitious one with this global social medicine group, is not only to highlight the various histories around the globe of social medicine, but also to think about how we might learn from social medicine traditions outside of North America and Europe that can be very helpful for pushing back against a contemporary colonial impulse, which is actually the hyper-technologicalization, if I can say that, the hyper-technologicalization, or the heavy emphasis on commercialized technologies, commercialized individually consumed technologies as an approach to healthcare and promotion of health, when we have so much to learn from other parts of the world that aren't quite as ensconced yet, or may have some alternative approaches that can help us to truly expand and deepen and improve our understandings of how to improve health, knowing that so much of what we see as health outcomes, they're actually a reflection of social pathologies and the impact of very toxic social environments and hierarchies and inequalities on health. So I just want to put that out there. It's an ambitious goal, but we have so much to learn from this auspicious panel about how to even begin thinking of that. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Green and Professor Hansen, for that lovely introduction. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Tinashe Goronga is a medical doctor specializing in public health, and he is a part-time organizer for Equal Health's global campaign against racism. He completed a social medicine course in Gulu, Uganda in 2015, and he remains involved in social medicine work through the Social Medicine Consortium. He is passionate about social justice and health equity. He is a co-founder of the Center for Health Equity in Zimbabwe, which aims to promote social justice and health equity in Zimbabwe through social medicine. He also sits on the board of the Sexual Rights Center, a local organization that works with key populations and advocates for the rights of sex workers and sexual minorities. Thank you so much, Dr. Goronga.
Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction, and it's nice to see everyone on the panel. I'm really motivated to be here. Yeah. So yeah, I'm calling from Zimbabwe, and when I read the topic of discussion, I think one of the first things that came to mind were like my own internal biases and thoughts concerning production of knowledge, particularly in terms of the system that we are a part of. Because the first reaction sometimes is to think of like, as someone from Zimbabwe, where you do not have an institution that's in the top 100, you think, how can I contribute to the world? Because the world is biased towards the leading institutions. And you're thinking, as a medical doctor who went through biomedical training, that's very focused on that, whose standards in terms of evidence-based medicine that we learned from, the standards, most of it were from Western institutions. So it's more from a consumptive perspective and less from a productive perspective in terms of contributing to the body of knowledge. Then the inferiority complexes that you battle with getting into a space that you have to deal with internalized racism, that you have to do with these dynamics in terms of how you can meaningfully contribute. So these are some of the key things that came to mind. And And particularly when you now look into the whole globe, into the global north and to the global south, like framing in terms of the structure of the world, these are some of the power dynamics that are quite apparent. And I just thought of, like, if you look at our planet, we have about seven continents and more than 150 countries, so many languages, and we have an estimated about 7.9 billion people. And think of such diversity that we already have, and think of it in terms of what potential each and every context can contribute. But often we do not realize that potential because of how we have perceived the world in terms of global south and global north, where global south has been viewed as usually, like, what comes to mind with most people is underdeveloped, and including myself from Zimbabwe. There's always that bias to think of when you think of global south. You think of being underdeveloped, you think about inferiority complexes, you think about poverty, infectious disease, the usual stereotypes. Then you think about global north, you think about the trendsetters, the chief judge of global systems and frameworks in terms of how we're supposed to be doing things. But what we also don't realize is, even up to today, like such, when you put the two, there's the persistent perpetuation of power dynamics that are rooted in colonialism, slavery, capitalism, and even when you look at the knowledge production of it, because essentially at the end of the day, the knowledge that, like, what we're discussing is it's a process of producing knowledge. It's this conversation that we're having. And if you look at now, the knowledge that's often referenced, it's often biased towards knowledge that is produced from the global north. And that same knowledge is expected, and the same approaches are expected to contribute to approaches that are used, for example, in a rural community in Zimbabwe, and often imposing new systems without considering already existing efforts. So in other words, already existing knowledges that could have been a part of the solution in terms of the complexities that the communities face often don't get signals. So now, when you're now, there's a when I was reading like an article about reimagining global, there's a phrase that the authors used, which I thought really summarizes quite well in terms of the whole knowledge aspect that I was referring to, where they're saying that the global north is primarily viewed as the ones who produce the knowledge, and the global south, the data, sorry, then the global south is the knowledge, then the global south is often, there's often the assumption that's where the data is. So in terms of the implementation of a lot of things happen in the global south, and I think we can go into the issues that relates to a lot of problematic biomedical experiments that happen to that. So now, what then do we mean when we are talking about the so-called south being the location for where we enter the conversation about social medicine? I think for me, it's about acknowledging already the potential that I mentioned earlier in terms of the diversity that we have, in terms of the people, in terms of the experiences, in terms of how they perceive the world. Because I think this is untapped potential because of how our world and our systems are structured in terms of the bias. So you'd find that there's a recent article which was published in the BFJ which talked about authorship, for example, on African papers during COVID-19, and he talked about 17% of the. So he talks about about the papers, only 3.9% of the articles related to COVID-19, for example, published in the top 10 medical journals being relevant to the African continent. Then you also find that one in 5 COVID-19 papers had no African authors. So now, if we're to look at that, since this is usually used as a proxy sometimes in the global out space, when you look at that already, you see there's inequitable inequalities in terms of knowledge production, and we really have to acknowledge some of the understanding and acknowledging the roots of that, and that brings in that whole conversation that a lot of people are uncomfortable with, which is the conversation of the legacies and exploitation that brings us where we are. So one of the key things that now we have to really look about when we're talking about the so-called South being the location where we enter the conversation about social medicine, we're looking into it gives us an opportunity really of unlearning the idea of supremacy in terms of, for example, Western approaches to medical education and health education, being in a space of curiosity where we are now open to knowledge production, particularly in local settings, in a way that also promotes global solidarity. And I also have to question about over-romanticizing our communities, because I often fall in the trap when I talk about social medicine, I talk about indigenous knowledge system with a lot of people, particularly in the communities, because for me, it's like in Zimbabwe, it's something as the Center of Health Equity, it's something that we are trying to work on and to see the potential that we can bring in terms of what Zimbabwe has to contribute in that space, like the different communities in Zimbabwe. So sometimes it's the danger of over-romanticizing things, and often sometimes painting our communities with one brush, which often overshadows a lot of the diversities that are in the within our communities. Then I think another thing that we have to think about is we're exploring particularly, and I think this is one thing that I love about the social, particularly the field of social medicine, is the idea of there's always that spaces of self-critique. Like when you read about a lot of frameworks that are introduced in the space, like a structural competence, there's always that space in global, there's always that space where there's where you reflect and you critique in terms of where you are in. And I think that brings in the new ways of which are not extractive or exploitative, in terms of how we can collaborate as communities. I was having a conversation Saturday with a colleague about the definition of health, basically where where I always refer to the WHO definition of health, which is brilliant, but I've never really thought about how different communities within Zimbabwe define health. And I think when I was talking to him, like his expression of what health really captured a lot more like social and spiritual aspects of disease causation and went beyond the biological basis. And this is something that we often talk about in social medicine, which is going beyond the biological basis of disease. And it made me think of certain biases that I have in this space, particularly because of my education, in terms of like a lot of opportunities that we sometimes miss out of collaboration, of learning from communities, of learning from different individuals. And when I worked in one of the rural communities in the northern west part of Zimbabwe, I asked someone about why he was. I asked the herbalist why he was unwilling to share his knowledge about herbs for scientific research, so that we establish evidence that can be used in trading. And his response made me reflect again on my position on my advice, where he said, you know what, the problem is I've nothing against advancements, and I've nothing against us producing knowledge and knowing the active ingredients of the herbs, for example, so that we create drugs. He said the problem that he has is the systems that we do it, because he said the problem is the moment he shares that knowledge with us scientists, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to come up with patents, and we're going to protect that knowledge. So at the end of the day, the communities that are supposed to benefit from the drugs that are manufactured from that, they will have to pay a price to get those drugs. And they end up, and the pharmaceutical company makes a lot of money without the community benefiting. So it's like, so from his perspective, he felt like if we do not address such issues, where we center communities, where we center livelihoods and not profits, then I don't think they'll be willing to share, because from his perspective, health is about the community, it's not about individual owners. It's about the community of everyone. And for me, it was a moment of reflection in terms of, this is a herbalist who doesn't have a PhD, who doesn't have any other like big qualification that we look at, that we tend to listen to, but the amount of wisdom that he had that I could learn from was quite amazing, particularly now where we're having a lot of conversation concerning the patents for the COVID-19 vaccine. So this is sort of that one of the things that we're looking at in terms of really when we are the global south, in terms of the so-called global south rather, can be a location when we enter a conversation about social medicine. But also we have to be mindful again in terms of in terms of tokenism, because again, before I get back into the whole power dynamics, where in that space there's also danger of tokenism, where representation is important, but it's not at the end of the day, but it's the voice present, or it's good to tick on a box that you have professors from institutions from the global south or contributing to this, or individuals from Zimbabwe, from this African country, but sometimes you find that in some spaces those voices are not listened to at all. But there's always, or sometimes their perspective it's always like some of the communication is always one directional, or sometimes it's dismissed. So these are some of the things that we're not looking into, particularly when you're not thinking about what we could mean now in terms of social medicine being the location of the conversation that we enter the South, because we're not looking. We have realized that in a lot of conversations that we have had, there's the decolonizing global health movement, all this showing that global health has failed us, which then, and social medicine brings us a certain opportunity, because I think one of the most important or strengths of it is the willingness to critique harmful systems and structures, the neoliberal policies, structural adjustments, and being explicit about colonialism. And because there's something that often a lot of people think they're not mentioned or included in conventional public health conversation, in conventional health conversation, which I think are really essential, really, when you're discussing about the so-called global South, because you can't separate the historical component and the influence of the legacies on the present day from the conversation, as much as a lot of people are fixated on the present, but we can't really ignore, because we're starting from an inequitable place, and we have to address some of the structural issues that are there. So I guess maybe that's when from my experience, where social medicine, I guess, plays like a better role, because what we're now, there's so many things that like there's so many frameworks that have been there that center communities, and there's so many practices that are within the social medicine space that we're still working on, is we're learning from communities that can help in terms of balance out some of the power dynamics. Like one of the things that I've mentioned, like the conversation that I mentioned earlier, I think in the past, I wouldn't have paid attention to the individuals that I talked to, because essentially, as a medical doctor in our system, you're expected to be to knowing everything, which is not always the case. But being in a space where you're now realizing, like, in terms of the importance of the narrative of individuals and the importance of the lived experience of people, you get to a point where you also start to listen to what they say and how they can contribute, how they can contribute meaningfully. And I think that's the beauty part of I think that's the most important thing about rather the strength of social medicine. It's those tools like narrative medicine. It's those tools like questioning the structural systems, the value of the lived stories, these things that sometimes may not gain value, and moving away from the more quantitative biomedical approaches to more inclusive and new systems and more participatory means. Yeah, so this is some of the things that I think really, really are very essential when you're exploring some of these dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tinashe. I think that's been such a great opening set of provocations for our conversation, and so much to already think with there. I'm sure everyone is making notes and they have lots of questions that they want to pose at the end of the presentations. I'm going to introduce our second speaker now. Our second speaker is Professor Mindy Thompson-Fulilove. She is a social psychiatrist and professor of urban policy and health at the New School. She has published over 100 scientific papers and 8 books, and her most recent book is Main Street: How a City's Heart Connects Us All, which was released by the New Village Press in September of last year. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Thanks for having me. It's very exciting to be here. And thanks so much for that opening talk. That was great. And Helena, good morning. Let me share my screen. I'm a social psychiatrist, which is a little bit different from social medicine. So I view my work both as a research discipline. Social psychiatry is primarily thought of as a research discipline, but also I'm trained in family therapy, so I'm interested in interventions in large social systems. So social psychiatry posits that strong social ties are fundamental to health. And one thing that's incontrovertible is that all societies have genius and relatedness from which to learn. And culture is such, Helena, correct me if I'm wrong, that the relatedness is not the same from place to place. And so the cumulative knowledge about how to be a good society is actually dispersed all around the globe. And certainly some of the things about how to be a good member of a society are in species other than our own. So what do we have to learn from bees or bats? Or there's a lot of knowledge about how to be a good society. And we need to learn this because most of our societies at this point are not so good. So the challenges in the era of imperialism have to do with the harms of the penetration of market economies and how that disrupts our society. And so the question that I think about is how do we counter the harms of imperialism? Certainly in the short term, while we have imperialism, and then in the long term, could we do something better? Could we learn from the relatedness of the world and do something better than imperialism? So one of the concepts when I was a young radical student was that of the fourth world. So there was the first world, second world, third world. The fourth world had to do with, among other things, subpopulations living in a first world country, but with living standards of those of a third world country. So this obviously referred to, and what it was meant to refer to, was all of the inner city and the conditions of populations that were oppressed. Certainly the Black population, et cetera. So in 1990, Drs. McCord and Freeman published a paper on excess mortality in Harlem, an African-American community in New York City. And they pointed out that the survival of Black men in Harlem, that they were less likely to reach the age of 65 than men in Bangladesh. So I think this is a way of putting in perspective what this fourth world concept means, certainly for health. So, and it has, in part, certainly for African-American populations, to do with this meeting of imperialism and Jim Crow. So American imperialism takes off in the 1890s as we go into the Spanish-American War and take the Philippines and other places around the world and really start to create our empire. But at the same time, at home, we're instituting Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws don't arise directly out of slavery. They arise 20 years later or after the end of Reconstruction in 1890s. So, but at that same time. And the experiences are parallel. So there's the trashing of communities. Certainly the recent massacre in Atlanta reminds us of the 1906 massacre in Atlanta and certainly many others. The stealing of land, the demeaning of customs, and fundamentally denying the intelligence of people. So that there's genius everywhere genius is belittled unless it comes in a sort of acceptable white middle class form, as was mentioned earlier, evidence-based medicine. I'm part of an organization called the University of Orange, which is a free people's university that we created in Orange, New Jersey, a small majority Black city outside of Newark, New Jersey. And one of the things about being a majority Black city, and Black at this point means African American, African, and Caribbean, so it's very multicultural, is that it's demeaned. So there's no intelligence there, there's no knowledge there. And so people from the area will laugh when we say University of Orange, because how could Orange have a university? And our assertion is that Orange is the university. The city is here to teach us. So we believe in universal, lifelong, and free education. And our theory is that everyone has something to teach and everyone has something to learn. We don't believe in having a professorial class where there's some people who are the teachers and other people who are the learners. We believe that it's reciprocal. 2-year-olds know more about an iPhone than I do, so I need to have them available to teach me at all times. So this reciprocity, how can we share our knowledge? And that knowledge is something to be shared among all the people is our profound belief. But we've also had a lot of learning from the South. I would say 2 things in particular. One is both related to Paulo Freire and his ideas about education. So one is popular education and the other is naming the moment. So I want to talk a little bit about popular education. I published a book on Main Street, and one of the things I talk about in the book is the City of Orange's effort to do urban renewal on the city's very vibrant Main Street, which serves its multicultural community. And this has a dangerous and bad idea meant to drive the poor out of the city. So we thought this was important for people to think about, and we wanted the whole of Essex County, the larger political unit, to join us. So we started this reading group. And so this is part of popular education. One of the things about reading groups is that people are expected to read. At the University of Orange, we say reading is awesome, but optional. So we want people to be able to come to a reading group and talk about the book and learn, because we've made it a lively session. And so our goal is to teach people everything they need to learn without them having to read the book. But of course, it would be good if they read the book. So one of the things about the process of reading of Main Street is that I learned a method of looking at cities from a Japanese environmental psychologist, Hirofumi Minami. And so the University of Orange decided that they wanted to teach that method to everybody who came to the reading group. So they developed a whole process for the Stroll and Scroll, and we happened to present this to the Center for the Living City earlier this week. And so this is what people put together. In the photo is David Chapin, me, and Hirofumi Minami when Hiro was teaching us how to do this Stroll and Scroll. And one of the things we did was walk Broadway in New York City. And then he taught us about the scroll, which was basically having walked to then reflect and to make a scroll. But he really literally meant scroll in the Japanese sense. This is a scroll that he's reflected on from the 13th century. And so it's a scroll being very, very long and literally being on rollers so that you unroll it from one end to the other and read it from right to left. So I had adapted this method in my book to show people the main streets that I had visited. And these illustrations were made by two young architects, Aditi Nair and Jacqueline Castaneda. And so we were all doing the presentation together, and they explained how they made the scrolls and what they thought about. But they also said, here's a score, you can do this too. So they made a short pamphlet about how to walk a main street, which is available on the University of Orange website. And they also made this very simple template to say, after you do your walk, put a few things together and then you'll have an understanding of your main street. And so this has been, what we suggested that people do during the Main Street. We took a walk during the Main Street Reading Group, socially distanced. And this is a scroll that I made during that walk, one of the sites on the Main Street in Orange, New Jersey. But then other people, so Martha Mudis, who's a doctoral student at TC, but also a dentist, walked her Main Street in New Rochelle, New York, which she had never visited before. And one of the things that's interesting is take a medical professional and send them out to look at where they live. And she learned a huge amount and became attached to her home in a way that she had not been before, and began to think, how might she amplify the Main Street and really become a part of the life of her city. So this is from her scroll, her Stroll and Scroll. And interestingly, her reinterpretation of how do you explain box, circle, line, we all found just really brilliant. So in doing this, people contribute new and deeper understanding, both of their own place and then to all of us. She also invited us all to come and stroll as soon as COVID allows. And the walk includes snacks, you'll notice. All communities in their genius include snacks, very important learning. It's just what snacks? And so it's really important to visit other communities because you could have new and great snacks that maybe you never had before. So Molly Rose Kaufman went in her neighborhood in Jersey City and saw when she called, she said, I called this all the things because I saw so many things in a very short, very short walk. And then from this, we were able to say, listen, we've been doing these walks, people have been doing it with us. As we come out of COVID, our main streets in the United States are going to be in big trouble. And how do we support them? And so this list of issues are from things that we saw from the Stroll and Scroll. And this is really the sort of naming the moment process that really comes to us in the North from Latin America, South America. In the sense that you have to figure out what's going on at this moment and how do you help. So this work of developing a way to teach it, getting a lot of people to do it, and then having learnings is part of naming the moment, part of popular education. And then we asked, why is it useful now? Why is Main Street useful now? And one of the things that we've said is that it's a big public space and people are full of pent-up need to just hang out with each other. And we think really rather literally to dance. And I just want to show you a couple minutes of, we're very inspired by this video from Wuhan. The sound is very low, but just watch the people dance. I just want to go back one slide. This is dancing in the street in the US, a little bit different style. And that's what's fun. If everybody goes dancing in the street, you can see a lot of different dancing. And in the, you know, I think really as social psychiatrists, profoundly desperate need for people to be in touch with each other. This dancing in the streets can be safe, it can be exciting, and can help us really return to some sense that we are a society, we are a collective, and we have other people in it with us. Thank you. That's the end of my remarks.
Thank you so much, Professor Fuller, for that really wonderful set of images and thoughts you've given us to think with. People are full of pent-up need to dance with each other. Well, I assure you, I have a lot of pent-up need to dance with other people. And this conference style that we have to engage in at the moment, I take small comfort in that we can share with a lot of people around the globe. But I am so sorry for the lack of snacks, because certainly snacks would have been great. I hope you all have your own snacks. But also, all societies have genius and relatedness. I think that's such a beautiful line, and will certainly be something we'll be thinking about in the conversation. So thank you so much. I'm going to introduce our third speaker now. Our third speaker is Professor Rama Baru. She is a medical sociologist. She's based at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, excuse my pronunciation. She has published widely on health policy, commercialization of medical care, and inequities in health outcomes in India. Thank you so much, Rama. It is wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you very much, organizers of the network, and to my panelists, and to my earlier two speakers. When I was figuring out how to really look at this question of the South, I was recent writings of political scientists on how do you problematize this idea of the North-South. And I think one of the very interesting pieces that I came across really said that, you know, this idea of the North and the South was used to a point, but in the way and the nature of the process of neoliberalism and this North and South was actually quite convenient to some of the issues that Tinashe raised about, you know, the it did really take us very much
Rama?
further. Yeah.
Rama, our audio is not too good, so I'm going to ask you to turn off your camera. Thank you. Let's see if that works better.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Yeah, this is a bad time for connect. But just said that I decided to really problematize the idea of the North and the South in a neoliberal, globalized world, post-Cold War, where of the bipolar world kind of collapse. One of the interesting contributions of scientists has been to really look at the global South as a transform, and found it interesting. It says that you don't have to necessarily look at it as a nation state, but actually of national activities where you look at practices, attitudes, and relations. And I view of that kind of a formulation is really to say that there is a North as much as there is North the South. And I think that if you look at the way certain knowledge systems are privileged, certain systems, entire discourse, then you find that this is something that therefore is global. And I think the important issue that has really, in the entire world today, and exemplifies it, is the inequalities that you see in wealth, inequalities in access to health services, and inequalities in health outcomes. When you even look at it from the perspective of the South, you have the richest people living in the Indian subcontinent amidst very high levels of poverty and inequality. And then you look at it's a new pattern of inequality. So I think the important contribution of many social scientists has been to focus back on the question of inequalities, which in my mind was so central when the ideas of social medicine from. And I think the ideas of social medicine and its circulation from Europe all had linked to our colonial history. And there was one particular form of social medicine that got privileged in which was an allopathy-led, state-supported health services. And the reason is it also meant that it kind of sidelined or did not take cognizance of other systems of medicine that was already in practice, but more importantly, even the role of tradition, the way it utilized the relationship, which Tinashe also referred to in his talk, between the body, mind, soul, and society. And I think this, so therefore you did have ideas of social medicine, which may not quite be the same as the Europe of social medicine because it has its own historical context. But the ideas that could be on the ways in which communities looked at social medicine. And one very important part of this whole project was a moral dimension. And I think that was very critical even in the European tradition. So you had this notion of the as a very core concern, of also looking at how you can mitigate poverty through social medicine, and to see the in terms of the epidemiological evidence between social economic conditions and health outcomes. I think those questions haven't been lost, but they have certainly been pushed much more, in my view, to the periphery with the rise of commercial medicine, of the technological health problems, and therefore that stream is in context. But there is also a very important contribution that social scientists have made, and I think there's something that in effort, I see that in Mindy's presentation as well, That is, what is the lived experiences of people? How they understand the relationship between their social condition health outcomes. For example, in the diseases, although it is peripheral to the mainstream public health, a lot of very interesting work that is out to say that lived experience, say with diabetes, and their understanding of why did they get diabetes, what happens in their daily life, kind of stresses and pressures seem to aggravate this particular condition. What happens? I also health services and social care and support. And I think there is a lot of evidence, even pandemic, the patients, whether you're in the north or in the south, of the kind of disruptions it has produced and how it has really affected the lives of those who are poor, but also a large section of the middle class. And so you find that, I remember medicine, and our center is rather unique in the Jawaharlal Nehru University because we are located in the School of Social Sciences, and it was a caution to do that. And I think part of the reason was to really look at the underprivileged. The question of equality was very central, but we also brought into our vocabulary social suffering. And I think this idea of social suffering as the core concern for social medicine is what you, even when you read the early history of social medicine, you have being expressed. So I really want to bring back this idea of not having a dichotomized view of not. And I think the alliances that have been formed through the people's health movements across the world
Rama
has actually been built on this idea of the, yes, am I?
Sorry, Rama, our audio feed is a bit trippy. I think shall we let move on to Kenneth, and we can see if your connection is a bit better after Kenneth has spoken. I think we're getting bits and pieces,
sure.
but we're not getting everything. We're getting bits of it, but but some of it is a little bit difficult. Yeah.
Okay. So
thank you so much, Rama. I think what we have heard from Rama is that the global south is a transnational idea rather than a nation state. Perhaps we should think about it in relation to attitudes and practices, and that the group at Delhi University has thought very much in terms of inequality and social suffering as two key concepts related to this discussion. And so I think let's try and pick up on that again when we come back to Rama's talk. Rama, thank you very much, and apologies for the technical difficulties. David is suggesting that if you do have a text that you could share with us on the chat, that'll be a way for people to engage with your talk before the discussion. Okay, so in the meantime, it is my pleasure to introduce our last speaker, Professor Kenneth de Camargo. He is a medical doctor and public health specialist with specialties in social and preventative medicine. He's based at the Institute of Social Medicine at the UERJ in Brazil. I will not try and pronounce it with its name. Perhaps you can do that for us, Kenneth. And he has published widely on the production, diffusion, and utilization of biomedical knowledge, applying the theoretical and methodological tools of science studies. The main themes of his research have dealt with HIV/AIDS, sexuality, healthcare, medicalization, and the spread of health misinformation on the internet. Very topical at present. Thank you very much, Professor Camargo, for joining us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm very thankful for the invitation. I have prepared a few slides that I'm going to present in a second. Okay. Can you see it? Okay.
Yes.
I decided to talk about the development, the theoretical and political development of social medicine in Brazil, and how it became this expression. Nowadays we talk about saúde coletiva, which would be literally translated into English as collective health, and I'll try to explain why this moniker. Public health in Brazil has a long history. It can dated back to the beginning of medical schools, from even before we became an independent nation in 1808. And there was a number of physicians who were formed by these early medical schools who became public intellectuals in the early 19th century throughout the beginning of the 20th century, which were very concerned with the Brazilian race and the health of the population, but in very racist and eugenic terms. And this has been very expressed in proposal of intervention of the public space. My colleague Jurandir Freire Costa has published a book a long time ago, as a classical. And by the way, quote unquote, this is a problem that we have, that Brazil is a country that speaks Portuguese and publishes in Portuguese. And unfortunately, that's not a very academic language. So a lot of what's produced here is not available for a more general public. But anyway, he wrote about several theses that were defended by physicians in Rio de Janeiro by the late 19th century, which spoke about how curricula in elementary schools should be structured, how the furniture in schools should be created. So showing that there's a huge movement of medicalization of the public space. Public health became very important in the beginning of the 20th century. It was driven by the need to sanitize ports. Rio de Janeiro was then the capital and a major port, very important in economic terms for the country. And that is synchronized with the origins of the Pan American Health Organization, which also began as a sort of consortium of nations in the continent around the need to sanitize and have health regulations for better trade. And a name emerges at this moment as a very important, as a sort of patron saint for public health in Brazil. Oswaldo Cruz was born in 1872, died in 1917. He was trained at Institut Pasteur in France and brought this technical scientific baggage for the public health in Brazil, and was very effective. He created one of the most important public health institutions in the country, Fundação Oswaldo Cruz nowadays, developed a lot of biologicals, serums and vaccines and so on and so forth, and managed to effectively eradicate yellow fever in Rio de Janeiro, but at a very high social cost. Whole neighborhoods were razed down, people were moved out of the houses, and we had a huge gentrification of downtown Rio de Janeiro. So there was a huge social cost for this process. And we have also a very important political background that started to emerge also from the beginning of the 20th century, that in the sense that workers' rights were slowly acknowledged, but that it's very paradoxical that sometimes that happens during a dictatorship, like for instance, the first Vargas government from 1930 to 1945. And that during that period, regiments of social security were created, which included medical assistance to regularly employed workers. And this will become very important later on. On the other hand, we have the split between medical care, which was connected to social security, and we had the Ministry of Health, which was involved basically of what we call vertical programs, like for instance, against syphilis or tuberculosis, and in charge of people who were called indigents, that was people who were totally destitute and had no means to pay for anything. And during the 30s, around that time, the Rockefeller Foundation started to have some influence here in Brazil, founding nursing schools, dietitian schools, and traditional public health was very, they had a very important hand in starting this in Brazil. Later on, moving in time, we had a US-backed military coup d'etat in '64, which implemented the military dictatorship. And again, paradoxically, there was an expansion of medical care during this period of time, but it was basically based on taxes, on payroll taxes that funded the private sector, private health sector. A scholar from the Times called that socialized debt and privatized profit. And at that same time, as a critique of this kind of arrangement started to emerge as part of the democratic resistance, as part of resistance against the military regime. And then we have a sort of coalescence of many theoretical strands into I would call it an emerging paradigm. First of all, the influence of the Keynesian economics at the CEPAL, was the economic committee from the UN hosted in Chile, that gave was the beginning of health planning, a very, although very technocratic planning, but anyway, in terms of thinking in social, more large social economic reasoning to health. And also, coalescence of a Marxist critique of medical apparatus, but the whole idea of the medical industrial complex that more or less matured around the beginning of the 80s, and the social determination of diseases, which was very linked to Latin American social medicine. And here I have to stress the importance of the pioneering role of Juan César Garcia, an Argentinian physician and social scientist that unfortunately was deceased very early, but who started working at the Pan American Health Organization. And from that position, he started fostering a lot of development in social medicine in the whole Latin America in general, and was very instrumental in creating graduate programs in social medicine in the continent. And also the influence of a non-Marxist left, especially French thinkers like Michel Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, and so on and so forth, in the social sciences, again, with a critique of the medicalization. And then we had this sort of the idea of collective health as a moniker to distinguish itself from the traditional public health. So that this is a sort of development of social medicine. And the name was sort of thought out in order to include more people, because social medicine was thought as a process involving basically physicians. And we had a lot of people from the social sciences working in the field at that time, philosophers, economists, and anthropologists, and so on and so forth. So a more inclusive term was needed. And new graduate programs at the beginning, basically master's programs, were created in the beginning of the 70s, in our case, from our institution in 74. And very important milestones in terms of the institutionalization of the new paradigm were the creation of SEBIS, which is sort of leftist think tank in social medicine and public health, and then the Brazilian Public Health, the Collective Health Association of Brasco, which was created in 1978. And this forced a new generation of intellectuals and political actors that were linked to what we call the Movimento da Reforma Sanitária, the sanitary reform movement, which was very important in terms not just of being a critique of the extant model for healthcare, but as well as a spearhead against the totalitarian regime that we had at the point. Then we have, in terms of the international context, the default from Mexico in 1982, the Latin American and the global South debt crisis, the so-called structural adjustment programs that led to furthering the economic crisis. There was a widespread loss of legitimacy, and this kind of healthcare model that was prevalent there, there was no longer there were resources to funding it because it was very wasteful. And a left-leaning techno-bureaucracy starts to implement piecemeal reforms in the extant healthcare system. As the military regime ended in 1985, a new constitution was voted in 88, and it enshrined the notion that health is a right. And it's arguably the biggest contribution of the whole movement is the creation of the national healthcare system, which we call SUS, Sistema Unificado de Saúde. At the same time, we had an academic mainstreaming of the collective health. But the more politically minded intellectuals in the field entered the public administration after the end of the dictatorship. Many became involved in the Ministry of Health, into state and municipal health secretariats, and so on and so forth. There was a sort of, lots of people flew out, the more politically involved people flew out of the academia. And at the same time, we had a bunch of epidemiologists started seeking graduation abroad in places like the US and the UK. At the same time, the area became acknowledged in the federal agencies' taxonomies here in Brazil, which is very important. So we were acknowledged as a specific knowledge field, and became an autonomous areas in graduate studies. And here we have a process of evaluation of those graduate studies by the Ministry of Education that is very much based on publications, has a very, very important weight in there. So this sort of brought about a new hegemony of epidemiology, which sort of detracted from the more politically minded development from the previous time. So in the end, what is collective health, what we call it? It's a complex field that comprises the production of knowledge and direct intervention in health matters, and has been canonically structured around 3 subdomains: health policy, planning and management, epidemiology, and social sciences and humanities and health. And despite all the problems, has emphasized critical thinking throughout its history. And right now, it's playing again a very important role in resisting the destruction of almost everything that we're experiencing in this country. So that's all that I have to talk to you right now. I'll wait for more feedback from the assistants. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth, for giving us a kind of rich case study to think with. I'm going to just have a look at the chat. Rama has tried to give us a few key points just to summarize her talk. So Rama has said, Global South as a transnational social term, not necessarily a nation state, as a set of practices, attitudes, and relations. With this understanding, there is a global North in the South and a global South in the North. The question of inequality and inequity is a core concern for social medicine in the North and South. The rise of neoliberalism and the commercialization of health services and the economy has health consequences, and we've just again heard from Professor Camargo in relation to that. And she also says the center where she teaches is unique in being located in the School of Social Sciences rather than in a medical school. Again, a nice linkages to Professor Camargo's talk in terms of where this knowledge production is taking place. And Rama, I would say the one other point that you made that you haven't mentioned yet is in the chat, is that of course that the form of social medicine that became kind of dominant via colonialism was one of state-supported health services, which then sidelined other models of social medicine, which I think we're trying to look at in these conversations. Rama, do you have any last thoughts you want to add before we move to a discussion with the panel?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, this idea of social medicine was very, very strongly influential in the post-independence period. And in fact, you had John Grant, you had Ryle, you had Sigris, who were actually advisors to the committee that designed the health services in India, which was the Bhore Committee. But it's also very interesting that it was allopathic centered and gave very little room for the indigenous systems of medicine. In fact, they were quite anti-indigenous systems of medicine, which like Ayurveda and others. But what is very important is that was the Nehruvian paradigm of modernity and science and technology. But you did have the Gandhian ideas of social medicine, which was very, very rooted in local communities, the idea of the body, the morality of being, you know, not addressing hunger in populations. So, and in a sense, Gandhi was anti-allopathy and modern medicine. So there are lots of these interesting tensions that come out in the way in which the post-Nehruvian, the post-independent model gives. But I just want to say one last thing. Many of the ideas of the alternative visions of social medicine, which in fact Kenneth also speaks about in Brazil, is that there was an influence of the left. There were ideas from China and Cuba and others, and the Gandhian socialist kind of modeling. But interestingly, these ideas actually got picked up by civil society movements in India. So you had a number of community health, very vibrant experiments where you talked about people's health in people's hands, which ran parallelly in a sense to the state-led health services. And there was very little conversation between the two. And, you know, there were some influences in the more progressive periods of Indian politics. But with the rise of commercialization, there was this separation of these experiments and these newer approaches to planning for health services at local levels, and completely, different trajectory in which the public health grew in India. And interestingly, preventive and social medicine departments within the medical colleges did not enjoy either the status or the prestige that other clinical specializations did. So, I mean, these are some of the ideas that I hope to sort of tease out in some of my writings, but these are some of the issues that I think I would like to place before all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rama. The connection there was very clear. So actually, hopefully we've now captured most of the key points you wanted to contribute. Thank you again. And thank you to all of our panelists. We now have an opportunity for questions from the floor for all of our panelists or the panel as a collective. You can either use the Q&A function or you can post something in the chat. I have one question in the Q&A, which we can use as our initial question, which is, does social medicine equate to alternative medicine? Like we see in India's push for alternative medicine with little evidence and a whole corporate FCMG profiteering off it. What are we pushing for when we say, listen to the South? Does one of our panelists want to respond to that as initial response?
Maybe from speaking from the context of Zimbabwe, when people talk about alternative medicine, usually what they refer to is usually limited to the biomedical lens most of the time in terms of disease, which I guess now is not. So you'd find that it's commonly used, for example, when people are talking about using alternative medicines like herbs as opposed to the Western medicine and lifestyle justification, but there's a limit with some of them in the sense that the phrasing is still around the biomedical component, of which now when you're now talking about social medicine, it now takes a broader component in terms of looking into the basis of disease and takes into consideration the structural issues. So I think it may, in terms of the context of alternative medicine, it probably may change from the context it may be different from one context to the other. But particularly in Zimbabwe, what I've noted in my practice is mostly from a biomedical lens without the structural component. So I would say it's different from social medicine.
Would any of our other panelists also like to respond to that question?
You know, when Tinashe spoke about knowledge and power and the unequal relationship, I think it is true for the relationship between an allopathy-dominated system and its relationship to alternative systems and indigenous systems of medicine. And this problem continues in the way in which the state very selectively draws into the use of indigenous systems, but doesn't give them the full authority or power to practice. So whether it is in terms of pharmaceuticals and drug research and things like that, you have to use the RCT model to verify the efficacy of a drug, which you cannot remove the drug production and the use from the system, the epistemology of that particular system of medicine. And it has become very handy to draw in indigenous systems because people are also seeing the limits of allopathy, especially for a lot of chronic conditions. So there is a huge market today, both for pharmaceutical products as well as therapies. And then, they marry with medical tourism. So you have Ayurvedic tourism, which brings together very nicely the ways in which all these come together. And I think this is the way in which at least the Indian government is, in a sense, instrumentalize the integration, in quotes, of Ayurvedic systems of medicine. And it also feeds into a Hindu nationalist view of, the great traditions that we should be proud of. But you don't, when it comes to actually the power, it's still very much in the hands of allopathic medicine.
Can I add something? I want to emphasize the social. I'm a social psychiatrist, so of course we're very invested in this, but and not the medicine, because I think the issue of social relations, how are we interconnected? That the point of imperialism and colonialism is to destroy social connection, and therefore to make everybody sick. So how do we counter that? And so that's why I think that's why we at the University of Orange have found it so important to institute popular education and naming the moment as social practices that we think are healing. And there are many others that we have also found from different places. But I just wanted to talk about those two today. So I think social medicine, I'm not a social medicine person, I'm a social psychiatrist. To me, it doesn't equate to alternative medicine. It's not about medicine, it's about the social. And how do we understand that the person is located in the social? And then how do we intervene in this catastrophe of imperialism to save the human species and a few others as well?
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to move on to two questions for Kenneth. Kenneth, perhaps we can read both of them and then you can respond to both of them at the same time. So Sebastian has asked, do you think it is useful to think about the contribution of public health scholars like Oswaldo Cruz, and therefore in terms of the division between disease-specific approaches like colonial medicine versus broad views on health like social medicine? Both approaches seem to be so entangled in the developments of Latin American public health during the 20th century that it begs the question if it's worth recognizing the two when thinking about the South. Also, considering the phenomenon of the judicialization of health, do you think that there's been an important narrowing of the view of health as a social right in the sanitarismo movement today? And then Francisco has asked, he said he is interested in the shift from social medicine to collective health, which you've discussed. He says, I asked several historical figures in the field and I had different answers. One, that social sounds very much socialist for the dictatorship, that social medicine was still related to preventive medicine, and also that social medicine was understood as community medicine. Now you have another explanation to find a more inclusive term that includes non-medical actors like social scientists. Are all these explanations correct, or do you think there is one explanation?
I'll begin with the second question, which I think it's easier for me to respond. I think I also have talked to several historical figures, and I have as many different responses to that question as people that I've talked to. I think there isn't one simple answer. But one thing that I think is very important is that there was a deliberate effort to distantiate this new field from the traditional public health, which was very medicalized, very biomedical, very colonial in the sense that was being spoken, and really trying to incorporate a broader field of discussion into it. So I think there are several different answers, but this is something that I can assure that was at least a very important part of it. As for the two questions from Sebastian, well, as I said, beginning with what I said last, in a sense, this new collective health is a deliberate effort to distantiate it from the traditional public health, although both are very present even today. And there is a sort of a Kuhnian and social tension between the two. The phenomenon of judicialization, for those who are not, this is a very complicated situation here in Brazil, but since the Constitution defined health as a right, there have been a number of initiatives of people recurring to the judicial system to have this right acknowledged and put into effectiveness. The problem is that this has also been recruited as another form of medicalization. There are pharmaceutical industries that have used this process to force the introduction of new drugs or drugs that haven't been authorized by the National Health Surveillance Agency to be used. So in the end, we have a very complicated, intense field. One thing that I tried to stress, I don't know if I was very successful, is that in a sense, when the new field became a more established mainstream academic field, some of the political drive was lost in a sense. So there was not so much political activism as there was in the past. I think this is being regained now because, again, the political situation has changed, and we've had a very adversarial relationship with the government in general. But I don't think that there is a narrowing of the idea of health as a social right in the movement as much as it's sort of complex development of society itself. That's what I have to say.
Thanks, Kenneth. We have a wonderful question now from Leandro for all the panelists, which I think is such a great question. What would be the 2 or more core competencies in social medicine undergraduate health students should learn? So perhaps each of you can give your 2 top competencies that you'd like to have medical health students learn. Perhaps we can start with Tinashe.
Oh, sorry. I think for me, one of the most important is the root cause analysis, where you are really looking into upstream. That has been very helpful in terms of situating the conversation and exploring the multiple dimensions of beyond, let's say, for example, a fracture, because you're not thinking about maybe the contribution of the terrain where the person is sitting. You're looking at the dynamics and you're looking at what happens when that person goes back home. So it looks at a more holistic approach to patient care or patient interaction when you're then I think another important one is that I found useful is the, I think, I don't know how best to phrase it, but the personal element of when you are in that space, reflecting on your own biases and power dynamics that are working in place that you're in. So that means it becomes an active process where you are not passive, but as a person, as an individual, you're contributing to that. So you're reflecting on your own, the biases that you're bringing in here. You're reflecting on the power dynamics that is happening. Like, for example, as a health professional, when you're in a clinical setting with the patient, you're already there's a power dynamics that are happening in the relationship. So you're mindful of that. Even when you go into communities, engaging communities in terms of how you can work together with communities. I think when you're reflecting on your position in that, it helps a lot in terms of in terms of even the interactions and openness and trying to create effective partnerships. I remember we used to talk about the 3 Ps a lot when we did social medicine, like the personal, partnership, and praxis. And so those I found those to be quite helpful even up to date when in a lot of engagement, be it in patient care or even when you're looking into working with communities.
Rama?
Yeah, having taught doctors in social sciences, I find that what Mindy spoke about, the Main Street, the idea of just, observing the communities in which they live. And we do have a placement to take them to rural areas. And it's very, very interesting that you actually can use observation for them to re-examine how they between medicine and society. And I would say that we have to combine this understanding of multiple social realities in the countries in which we live in, and also to examine one's own positionality to understand how we view the other. And, so to be able to build in at least some ideas of a certain questioning of one's own positionality and how you view the other is both an area of importance for social medicine, but it also has a lot of interesting pedagogical challenges. And I do believe that social psychiatry and social medicine are in fact very, very closely related, and you need to bring them together. And that is only possible if you do an interdisciplinary kind of teaching. And
I'd like to add that to what was just being said, that part of the issue is that you have to have a concept of the social. And certainly going out into wherever you are and just looking at it helps to have a concept of the social. The biomedical hegemonic discourse is only about what's going on inside the person. And people going into health have already adopted that. Even as undergraduates, they already think that way. So it's a huge fight to get them to see that the person is not separate from the social, that they are inextricably linked. A story in that regard, I was in Minneapolis and learning about a health center that was being built in a very multi-ethnic neighborhood in South Minneapolis. And the people who were doing it had had 2,000 interviews with patients, with staff, with people in the neighborhood about what to do. And one of the things that the immigrant populations in that area said to them was, your examination rooms are too small. You think only the patient should go into the room, but we bring the whole family. And that was stunning to people, but they said, oh, okay, we'll have bigger rooms, but they wouldn't have thought of that. So if you really start to take the social seriously, you're going to do things like, how do you build a hospital? You're going to do it really differently. But this is a huge uphill battle, and I'm so grateful to Helena for her leadership in insisting to people. I don't think she's gotten very far just yet, but I hope that new generations will really understand that we can't separate the individual from the social, and that as physicians, we have to respect the social and work in the social. So teaching the social in all the ways, all the social sciences, all the observances, all the models. I've always worked from the biopsychosocial model, but whatever model you do that goes from the patient to the social, that's what we have to teach.
I'd like to add that, first of all, only two is very complicated, but from a more philosophical point of view, I think that's what Rama said about having an interdisciplinary approach on the one hand, and being capable of self-criticism and have a reflexive thinking about things in general is very important. In disciplinary terms, I think that at least a basic working knowledge of social sciences in general and social epidemiology would be very important.
I can only agree as someone who studied biomedicine and then went and did a PhD in anthropology, because I felt I needed some additional training. Wonderful.
May I just add just one more dimension, which is the politics of health. And I think when you teach policy, if you don't understand politics, it's sort of, it gets reduced to a lot of evaluations of various kinds or impacts. But I think the politics is extremely crucial aspect of social medicine.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Ram. And Mindy's example about the size of consultation rooms and your points about the politics of health, practicing in South Africa in hospitals that were historically designed for segregation and now trying to work within those structures, is just an example that brings together those two things so tragically. So certainly that architecture and history and politics. We have a kind of question that relates to this from Angela. Wonderful and enlightening conference, thank you. I have a question about the geographies in which we situate today's conversation. How global is this global South we're talking about or speaking from? Does it encompass local clusters of South within the global North? I'm thinking, for example, of anything between Indigenous peoples in Canadian territory to the austerity or adjustment programs imposed on Southern European countries that flip over the metropole periphery binary or the global North, global South divide? Or is the global South also about positionality and what is at stake in one's research? So I think Ram has responded a little bit to the question of positionality, but if everyone else would like to comment on the other dimension to the question. Mindy, yes?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this question since it was posted. I think global South, global North is one of those things that obscures more than it enlightens. And that's the whole point when people said, no, there's a fourth world, which is the oppression within the United States. Many theorists have argued that the whole of the American South is a colony of the American North. But certainly the inner cities all across America have been trashed and abandoned. And I think what it obscures are the political processes of global imperialism, and then the context of that, which is colonialism and how that has But even deeper than that is, it's about the market and how the market penetrates. And as Dr. Rob Wallace explains in his wonderful book, Dead Epidemiologists, about COVID, this penetration of the market into every corner of the globe brings back all diseases that we have never seen before. So if we think about who is being harmed by the penetration of the market, well, that is pretty much every living species on Earth. So I think Global South is a really good term to quit using, and let's get more blunt. I don't think we have a lot of time given global warming, terrible tornadoes wiping out the American South this week. We don't have a lot of Gulf Stream moving. Imagine the Gulf Stream moving. The Arctic fence, which used to keep the cold weather in Canada, now no more Arctic fence, so the cold weather comes down to Texas. I don't think we have a lot of time, and I think if we don't get blunt about what's going on, we're going down.
Yeah, always
Yep.
good to contextualize. Tinashe, did you want to follow up on that?
Yes, I just wanted to quickly that I totally agree with what Minnie mentioned in terms of how the terms themselves are problem. They make a lot of assumptions, and they do not really bring out some of the complex dynamics that are happening. Because another term that comes to mind, someone asked me about sub-Saharan Africa in terms of when you look at what does that term mean, and or in terms of geography and the reality. And when you look at South Africa, for example, you look at the divide between the racial divide in terms of the context that one group of people is living and over the other groups of people. So it sort of overshadows some of those dynamics that happen, because someone would not think about the exploitation of indigenous communities in the United States of America, as mentioned earlier on. And I think what's giving me hope and what I'm grateful is the solidarity that a lot of particularly the Black, Indigenous, and people of color are building globally, where they're realizing some of their shared struggles, even sometimes if they are in countries that are viewed as the global norm. Because when you really look at even the life expectancies across, there's a book company, I think it's called The Death Cap, if I'm not mistaken, where he talks about, it was based on Chicago, where you're looking at the life expectancies within the Chicago. So when you're not looking into so a lot of these collaborations that are happening now across borders are actually showing the shared struggles. And I agree that now I think we really have to be explicit in terms of naming the systems of oppression that are causing the systems, and actually do away with certain terms that continue to perpetuate those dynamics.
Just like to add two things, because I think a lot of the discussion about the moniker Global South is about otherness. It's the whole thing about the different and whatnot. And at the same time, I think that something I think that Rama said about the Global South and the Global North reminded me of something that the Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells wrote a long time ago about the Fourth World and the pockets of poverty that you have everywhere, including the so-called developed nations. So I think that a lot of problem has to do with power relationships and racism and exploitation and neoliberalism, as many of the panelists have talked about. So I think that in a sense, this whole Global South, on the one hand, it sort of glosses over the many different situations that we have all over the places, like people in the so-called Global North talk about, for instance, Africa or Latin America as if it were just one huge block without any difference within countries, and between countries and within countries and themselves. And on the other hand, avoiding looking inside to the problems that there are with local populations as well. I think the very interesting approach to that is what has been done by people like, for instance, the People's Health Movement, trying to unite different oppressed minorities and peoples all over the world in terms of having truly the rallying cry from Alma Ata from the 70s of healthcare for all, health for all in the year 2000. We're way beyond that when we haven't achieved that yet.
I mean, I just want to say that when I meant the global north in the south, it has very, very serious implications for countries like India, because you have a globalized middle class today, which is very much aligned to the ideology of the global north. And it also is the case that the elites in a liberalized market are engaged very, I mean, there is a very close fit between the north in the south that then in a sense also determines policies. And I think this is, so even when you have the People's Health Movement and other social movements questioning it, we do not find the kind of pace to really create too much of a change in this rather powerful discourse which is going on globally. And I think this is a huge challenge.
We have a few other questions related to training, but before we move to that, I'd like to take the chair's prerogative to follow up on this, to ask a question perhaps for Mindy and Tinashe, but for the rest of the panel as well. Mindy introduced this really lovely concept of reciprocity and that everyone can learn from everyone else, and gave us this really lovely example of the scroll and producing that. And I think that's a really wonderful kind of local empirical example of how to do this kind of work that we're talking about. And I wondered if the panel could expand on how one operationalizes these collaborations that overcome some of these problems we're discussing.
I think it's a wonderful issue to raise up. That first of all, I think you have to believe that everyone has something to teach and everyone has something to learn. So that challenges a lot of assumptions that only the professoriate or some people who've been certified have something to teach. But that everybody and it's not only everybody at every age. So a 2-year-old, a baby has something to teach. If we want to stop, if we think of Piaget and what he learned from babies, everybody has something to teach. So I think this in a sense challenges the assumptive world of racism and imperialism, which is that only some people have knowledge, only some people are worth listening to, only some people are worthwhile, and the other people who are not worthwhile can just be killed. So everyone has something to teach, everyone has something to learn is the fundamental challenge, and lifts up the importance of every human life. But then how do you operationalize that? And I had the opportunity to start a program at 2 medical schools, UCSF and Columbia, which said that we didn't have high-risk students, we had high-risk courses. And that the way to handle the high-risk courses was to provide workshops where students could work through the things that were likely to trip them up. And these workshops were led by second-year students for first-year students. And they basically eliminated failure at those 2 medical schools. But they not only eliminated failure, they created a much more collaborative atmosphere. UCSF was already a very collaborative place. One of the things that happened there as it became a friendlier place was people started taking a year off to explore how they wanted to be a doctor. At Columbia, which was a very competitive place, it created a much more cooperative experience, but it really lifted up the students as teachers of each other, that the students actually knew what the problem was with the course in a way the faculty did not. And the faculty couldn't solve the problem, and they didn't want to. They wanted to be mean. So it can be, I think that it involves experiments and trying things out. But once we open up this assumptive world, and you start to look around as who has something to teach me, you find that many people do. There's a wonderful American movie called Akeelah and the Bee about a young woman who wants to win a spelling bee. And she finds that everybody in her neighborhood can be her teacher. It's a great movie.
Tinashe is having some network issues. Tinashe, are you back with us?
Yes, it looks like I'm back with you. I switched off my camera a bit to improve the connection. So I guess, so in terms of the practice part of it, if I got the bits of the questions that I got, that's a that's always a very difficult thing to implement most of the time. Particularly, I know someone in the chat had asked about, for example, working with even within the health space, working with different health professionals, with nurses, doctors, and all. And when you're not looking into the broader community, and I think one of the platforms, for example, the Social Medicine Consortium has been trying to like create such collaborative spaces. But we also have to acknowledge again, like some of the limitations in terms of who has access to those spaces, in terms of most ordinary people do not have access to those spaces. It's mostly health professionals or people of certain who are considered to have certain knowledge in that. And I think even when you look at our approaches to a lot of things, it's often that way. But one of the key things that we've been trying to look into, or even have a conversation with, particularly, is we are trying to establish, as we're working with the Center for Health Equity in Zimbabwe, is really to see how best we can create inclusive spaces where we're deliberate about acknowledging some of exactly the power dynamics that act as barriers, and try to promote a culture where each and every person can be heard. So I remember someone was saying that even one of the things that we can even do is in future panels, we hope to see ordinary people sharing their lived experiences, and not just like a professor in X and Y Z who's studied this, but may not have the same lived experiences, but may not have the lived experience element. And I think that element of trying to recognize that everyone has something and very important to bring is very helpful. And in terms of facilitating the relationship building, that can allow them even to contribute, and even for their thoughts and their contribution, for them to feel that their thoughts and contribution are valued. So I guess it's something that we are all trying to work on in our different networks, and something that we are trying to find the best ways to work on. And I think there are a lot of things that we still have to unlearn in terms of the, like, some of the people that we allow and sometimes not allow in our spaces, be deliberately or subconsciously. So it's still it's still work in progress. So I guess in a good starting point would be maybe community attachment, particularly if you're like in the context of health professionals, getting them more into communities, making them learn from the communities. I remember one of my colleagues, she came up with a brilliant idea where every health student had to come back, like instead of having health students make a presentation or a project about a health condition in the community, each student was asked to write an essay reflecting on their interaction with one particular patient, in terms of, so they were asked to have that relationship during the period of their community attachment, learn how the life of that person, learn from that person, then submit an essay where they reflect on their relationship and the complexities of that person's life, and how it added value even to what they do, what they're doing, what they learned from. So the emphasis is now less the person, the community is no longer only a subject, but they become a partner in the process of educating the health professional who eventually be with them. So it's now trying to rethink and re-looking into some of the models that we have and approaches.
Thanks, Tinashe. Rama and Kenneth, do you have any responses before we move on to the last questions?
I think the most important thing is of being able to offer spaces and experiences that people can relate to and then reflect upon. A few things that jump to my mind is that certain advances that we have in terms of public policy that were related to really hearing the affected people with regards here in Brazil to HIV/AIDS, which had a very important community engagement and helped design, and I think all over the world, helped design better approaches to the whole problem. And here in terms of also psychiatric reform, that was something that was done we had a very bad situation with institutionalized patients that were in mental institutions which had an average time of admission of 40 years or something like that. and getting those people out and into protected houses and so on and so forth. And having the families, having the patients, having everyone involved was very important. So I think if you have this concrete cases where people can learn and experience the real situations are very important.
Yeah, I think the other panelists have really given a very rich array of things that are possible. And I think from our own experience, we find that actually exposing students to the community, but not just to the community like they do in preventive and social medicine departments, but to be able to give them that sensitivity to be able to assess. And also I find that students themselves start questioning the many assumptions they come with. And in a sense, you're re-socializing them to think differently. And I think that is a very exciting project in itself.
Thank you so much. So returning to our question around competencies for training health practitioners, Zara says she agrees wholeheartedly that all healthcare workers should consider the life circumstances and contexts of people they care for and adapt their care and service accordingly. But how do we strategically address the often dismissive and sometimes even aggressive response from the dominant biomedical establishment, especially from more senior health workers who are training students and feel that the curricula is already too crowded? And then Raul has said also, in relation to the question of education, what social medicine insights or practices have helped you address the matter of interprofessional communication between physicians, nurses, and pharmacists and other healthcare workers?
I wish I knew the answer to the first question because something that we struggle with every day. But I can point to the second question, to a personal experience during my formation, as I was a medical resident, and we created a new health facility from the ground, and it was projected to work as an interdisciplinary facility with nurses, dietitians, and whatnot, and we all worked together. I think that was the most, that was a learning experience and a very important experience as well. Doing things together.
You know, I think that it is a very difficult thing to change the biomedical establishment. And again, we have to think about the role of imperialism. Think about how much profit the drug companies are going to make from these vaccines, and how the controlling the patents is going to screw all of us, because we're not going to vaccinate half the world, and then COVID's going to mutate to something that'll come back, and it's just sickening. But related to that, I have to say, I moved outside the medical system and did all my work in public health and in community organizations, which I think is important. But Helena works inside the system. So I think you have to have both. You have to have people who are critics and who say what you're doing is ridiculous. That would be me. And then you have to have people who say, now let's think about this slightly differently, and can we teach you some new competencies? That would be Helena.
Yeah, true. I agree about how it's very difficult because, like, I find myself sometimes when you are like you're dealing with, first and foremost, the government system. When I was working in the government most of the time, you're dealing with the government systems and ways of approaching which are really fixed and prescriptive, and sometimes little room for you for much innovation. And there are other issues that are coming in where people will say you're spending too much time with a patient and there's a long queue. So really, all these dynamics come into play, and you have colleagues who really agree about it. So one of the motivation, particularly for us to establish the center as SOCMED, alumni of the social medicine course, was because we realized that it was really difficult for us to achieve much because of the resistance that are coming from the system. So we try to find ways of how we can create something independent that can complement the system, that also brings in the flexibility for us to work with people in the system in terms of bit by bit influencing change in the small spheres of influence that we can, and try, because the advantage of that is sometimes there is less red tape. So there are also yes, they are, but then to gain the reputation and the influence for the system to trust you, it takes time. But we thought maybe like having that approach where we have structures outside the system and structures that are in the system, then find ways to find ways how they can make complementary. But maybe we're still trying to find the best approach and the best answer. So we're trying to explore this and see how it works. Then in terms of promotion of like a collaboration amongst health professionals across, I think that's another very difficult one, because again, already because of how historically and presently how our professions are structured. It's usually the physicians, like there's this hierarchy that's going on. And I think one of the, like in my own practice, one of the ways that I've tried to go around that is by trying by all means to first and foremost to when amongst colleagues to do away with titles, because titles are very big in our context. The people really are important about titles. Then try to establish that conversation where you can talk to anyone and build a relationship and make that possible. But again, you face resistance from all, because I know like at some point one of the chief nursing staff approached me and they said they were not comfortable with the way they thought nurses were some nurses by approaching me directly, they were disrespecting me as a medical doctor. So they actually punished them for that. So I had to intervene. I said, no, actually, no. I said they could approach me directly. So you also have to do away. So there's a lot of systems that we have that have been dominant for quite a while that still need to be dismantled, and questions for us to create true collaborative space. And I think where we center ultimately the welfare of the patient and not the power dynamics that are happening there.
I think the People's Health Movement, and especially medical professionals associated with the People's Health Movement, have tried to form alliances of, say, doctors who would sort of engage with communities, use spaces for dialogue. But, it's not as if it's a large presence, but certainly it's ongoing. And there is a lot of resistance from their own community of the medical profession and its hierarchy. But to say that nothing is happening would not be correct, but you can also say that it's really an uphill task, I think. And another example is if any of us have representation on some policy committee, and my experience with tuberculosis was particularly interesting, because when they said, oh, we have to talk about determinants beyond delivering the drug. And then I said, you don't have to go very far. You just have to listen to your DOT providers and ask them what has been their experience. And they will tell you what the lives of patients are like. But you don't want to listen to that. So you don't have to get an external trainer to talk about it, but you can just listen to your own frontline staff who see this very intimate relationship between the social conditions, access to care, continuity of care, and questions around the kind of stresses that their lives are dealing with. So I think using spaces of that kind, they may be small, but it's very important to use them.
Well, I think we're coming up to the end of our session. I'm not surprised that we've used up almost all the time with this wonderful discussion. I think that we've touched on across the various talks and across the discussion the need for self-critique, as Tinashe has highlighted, and self-reflection and reflecting on positionality. I think Mindy has really given us this lovely reminder: all societies have genius in relation to relatedness, and they don't look the same. And even just this discussion around the use of titles and honorifics is an example of how culturally these things are very different. We need to think in more reciprocal ways and operationalize that in creative ways with the communities with whom we work. And I think Kenneth and Rama have both given us wonderful examples of how we can never overlook the politics of health and the context in which we are working. So I really want to thank all of our panelists again for providing us with such a rich set of responses to think with. And I'd also like to remind everyone that this is only the beginning of this conversation. We have another panel on Monday who will speak to the same provocations from different locations. We really look forward to seeing you all there as well. Please do note that on Monday, there will have been a time change. So some parts of the world, it will be at a different time than it was today. So please just check that on the poster. And please be in touch. Our network is open. We're really keen to expand the conversation. And thank you all for attending.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Great to meet you all.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.